So I'll begin. In the first book of the Oratore, Cicero is surprised that Plato in the dialogue criticizes the rhetoric, but at the same time proves to be a brilliant rhetorician himself. Every reader of the Platonic dialogues will confirm this impression. Socrates' critical remarks on traditional rhetoric also prove him to be a master. In fact, in the Apology, Socrates applies strategies, procedures, or topoi that are often used in court speeches. In other dialogues as well, Socrates applies communicative strategies which already Homer described poems and which later formed part of the techne of rhetoric. Plato's Socrates, or it seems to me, has a great repertoire of rhetorical tools at his disposal, which he uses as the other Socrates of other Socratics have as well. Antisthenes' Socrates, for instance, refers to Homer's Odysseus and his Polytopia to justify his use of rhetorical strategies. As to the sophists, the Socratic Antisthenes claims to strive for truth, to conform to the addressee, and to observe the oion in discussions, as Plato's Socrates does as well, in the Phaedrus traits in Plato's dialogues as well. Aeschines' Socrates also seems to be well prepared to practice rhetoric as far as we know. It seems then that according to the Socratics, rhetoric does not seem foreign to Socrates. And yet, Plato's Socrates criticizes rhetoric in a very strong terms, barely in the Gorgias. This, of course, creates problems for readers of Plato's dialogues, like, for instance, in fact, one wonders what role theoretical persuasion possibly could play in philosophical discussion at all, which, according to Plato, strives for the truth, not for what seems to be. Why then, or so we might ask, as Cicero does, in Plato's Socrates, is Plato's Socrates sometimes prepared to make use or even to combine persuasive and argumentative in his philosophical conversations? To answer this question, it is helpful to remind ourselves of a peculiarity of Plato's art of composing dialogues. Like poets before and after him, Plato describes different kinds of discourses and illustrates the behavior of the interlocutors in his dialogues. He also reflects upon the rules and functions of literary motives or of communicative methods. That is, often Plato, the author, is his own interpreter and helps to understand better what Plato, the philosopher, is trying to convey to the recipients. I shall argue that this also is the case. Cicero's question as to why and how and when Plato's Socrates applies rhetorical strategies in his dialogues. I shall maintain that the position of Plato's Socrates is not just critical, but his, or it seems to be, is more complex. For Plato not only indicates that his proto-philosopher Socrates accepts rhetorical strategies such as parable speech, example, myth, or accumulative arguments, but Plato's Socrates also illustrates and explains on the performative level of the dialogues why and in what context this might be the case. Socrates often uses persuasion, or so I shall argue, when he addresses partners who are ordinary people who might be talented but are not really philosophical minded and therefore have difficulties to trust rational arguments and may hesitate to accept rational arguments and to act accordingly, even if they agree that the arguments seem to be coherent and plausible. Therefore, some psychological or pedagogical treatment might be helpful. The author illustrates and indicates, or so I shall try to show, Socrates incorporates persuasive strategies in his conversation for that reason, i.e., to prepare his partners and readers accept rational arguments or apodixes and to adopt their results without hesitation. Plato's Socrates, however, does not just apply traditional persuasion, but he transforms it into what one might call a pedagogic, does not aim at winning a rhetorical contest and on increasing his power, as traditional orators or sophists tend to do. Plato's Socrates rather tries to improve on his partner's insights, disposition, or says, on his or her souls. Thus, he behaves like what in the Gorgias he calls a true politician or orator, who does not behave like an egoist looking for his own advantage only, but who rather cares for the well-being of his fellow citizens. My thesis then is that elements of traditional rhetoric are accepted as part of the philosophical discourse by Plato's Socrates to serve as a praeparatio philosophica, or an philosophiae, as it were, helping his partners in their search for truth. Let us first turn to the Gorgias. The Gorgias is regarded as a key witness to Plato's critical attitude toward rhetoric. In this dialogue, as traditional rhetoric as an illusory science, that is, not about truth, but about the plausible, and is always adapting to the respective circumstances. Socrates criticizes that traditional rhetoric serves every purpose in the, at the culinary art of cooking. For traditional rhetoric, or so Socrates argues, entertains the addressees and asserts one's own interests without moral responsibility. Traditional rhetoric thus proves to be a skill used for both good and evil. Such a value-neutral rhetoric without moral control may be a welcome instrument for a way of life that, as Callicles sees it, invokes the supposed right of advantage, generates plausibility of thesis with probability of arguments, strengthens weaker theses, and thus can bring about success in politics and in court. But it nevertheless remains an illusory without striving for truth or moral orientation. It does not take into account that injustice, even if it is carried out successfully, causes damage to the soul of a person who does injustice and is therefore to the happiness of the person. Despite this fundamental criticism, Socrates also hints at a perspective that assigns to rhetoric a role with philosophical discourse. To achieve this, however, is necessary in the objective of rhetoric and in the way people live their lives. According to Plato, Socrates, traditional orators always wish to promote their own interests and for that reason are prepared to accustom themselves to have the likes of the addressee and to flatter and gratify the audience. Yet this exactly is what, according to Socrates, true rhetoric should avoid doing. True rhetoric rather should try to take care of the addressee to prove his or her soul, prostor beltiston legein, and to make the citizens' souls as good as possible. Plato Socrates accepts this postulate of legein prostor beltiston, which of course often is used in politics of his time, but he transforms it. For, as he clarifies in Gorgias, by improvement, Socrates means to create order, cosmos, within the soul of his partners, and thereby unity. That is, Plato Socrates develops his concept of a new kind of rhetoric by a kind of internalization of aim, cosmos, and by introducing of what he calls goodwill towards his partners. It is not by chance, therefore, that Plato Socrates terms his true rhetoric also as a true politics, because the aspect of order within the soul signals that both Socrates' philosophy and rhetoric are therapeutic in that they take care of the souls of his fellow citizens, to free them from misconceptions by refuting them, and to help them deal with other people and the institutions of a community in a correct manner. The aims and intention of true rhetoric and philosophy merge. This is why Plato Socrates prepared to integrate elements of traditional persuasion such as comparisons, mythical narratives, or tragedies, argument accumulation into the context of philosophical dialectics. But he does so under the condition that traditional rhetoric is transformed into a kind of pedagogical method which helps to improve the souls of the addressees. In this perspective, both true rhetoric and philosophy share common interests and aims. This transformation of traditional rhetoric helps to understand, or so I think, under what condition Plato prepared to integrate rhetorical strategy in the philosophical discourse. One might also wonder, though, why and when Plato thinks that tradition of persuasion might be helpful and necessary. After all, according to Plato's Socrates, true knowledge can be acquired only with the help of the dialectical method. And Plato's Socrates, of course, is convinced that anyone who knows the right thing also will do it. So what role he attribute to rhetoric in this context? Now, one should keep in mind that Plato's Socrates himself clearly is presented as an ideal of the true philosopher. In the dialogues, however, Socrates is dealing with partners who are ordinary people. They are not Socrateses, but often have difficulties to follow his arguments and hesitate to accept the results of Socrates' arguments, although they sometimes agree that they find them impressive. In such notions, obviously, jeopardize their rational thought process and make them waver, as Plato, the author, describes so vividly. In such cases, Socrates' well-constructed arguments obviously are not sufficient to win over the interest. I therefore propose to focus for a moment not on Socrates only, as in most cases we do, but also on his partners and their behavior. For I shall argue that in situations like these, it makes for to apply rhetorical strategies to win them over by establishing a disposition in them which allows him or her to adapt to the results of his argumentation and to act accordingly, for sure. Situations in which someone is overwhelmed by emotions and therefore proves to be unable to accept rational arguments are discussed philosophically and psychologically in the Republic and, of course, in the laws and elsewhere. But which Plato in his earlier dialogues illustrates on the performative and dramatic level of the dialogues how Socrates' partners sometimes recognize that philosophical proposals might be right, but obviously hesitate or even refuse to accept them and behave accordingly. Plato, the author, explains this by describing these situations vividly and by analyzing them using literary motives or metaphors. That Plato is well aware that and why people not always abide by rational arguments, but often are hindered to do so by some inner source of resistance. I shall argue that in situations like Plato indicates that persuasion is in place even in philosophical discourse. I shall remind us of some passages which also I think are of interest. Is taken from Discourse. Here, the figure of Callicles and his reaction to Socrates' main argument that it is worse to do harm than to suffer it is telling. For although Callicles thinks that Socrates' arguments seem strange to him, nevertheless, Prest wrote, "I don't know how, in a way, I feel good about what you say, Socrates, but like most of them, the others, I don't believe you very much." Callicles then feels that he should be convinced by what Socrates has to say, but he refuses to accept the results of his argument. He's not able to say why he feels that way and how to refute Socrates. Socrates offers an explanation for his situation. Callicles laughs for the common opinion that causes resistance in his soul and makes him waver. It is a Callicles within Callicles, as Socrates describes it, who make him disagree with Socrates and force to follow common opinion, 482b. This Callicles forces Callicles to give in to his emotions and to common opinion, to be guided by rational arguments and therefore to contradict himself. This little scene illustrates well also, I think, that according to Plato's Socrates, sometimes more than rational arguments are needed to win over a partner for philosophical position, because doubts against the force of philosophical apodoxis have to be eliminated. The scene in Gorgias, of course, is not the only one in the dialogues. I shall mention just a few of them. In the Philos have difficulties to accept the result arguments that soul is immortal, although both of them are familiar with argumentations, regard Socrates' arguments as coherent and compelling, and are prepared to the power of the Logos. Yet Socrates' partners both remain skeptical and are full of disbelief. Again, the source of this resistance is identified, and it is described by a metaphor. Child inside the man hopes to sing charms, epoidai, to this child in order to eradicate the disbelief of his partners and to instill faith and to purify his interlocutors from passions which hinder them from accepting the rational arguments. So, by what he calls paramithia. As it turns out, this paramithia consists of an accumulation of a series of arguments for the immortality of the soul. This accumulation of arguments, of course, is a strategy which is well known from forensic rhetoric. That is, Socrates uses philosophical arguments, but he applies them as an orator does, rather than a philosopher. For should regard one coherent and compelling argument as sufficient to prove the case and to convince the partner. The metaphor of the child in man signals an independent source within man, which fights back argumentation, is reminiscence of the metaphor Callicles in the Gorgias, but also of other passages where Plato describes on a performative level inner resistance of his partners against rational arguments. They are meant, those metaphors are meant to remind the reader that a coherent argumentative constraint does not automatically generate conviction to see. They often even illustrate that Socrates' partners are well aware of this situation and even comment on it. This is the case when, for instance, when Alcibiades in the Symposium confesses to be impressed with Socrates' arguments and even recognizes that they are compelling. Yet he nevertheless is not prepared to accept the results. He concedes that Socrates had brought him to realize that he had many shortcomings and had to change his life. He even feels ashamed that he could not contradict Socrates, but at the same time, he concedes that he would not follow Socrates' instructions. Despite all these insights, Alcibiades does not see himself in a position to get involved in Athens' political affairs. Certainly, scenes like the ones referred to prove, once again, Plato's brilliance as an artist who is able to describe and analyze the behavior of Socrates' partners, are very talented people and perceive their behavior as defective and even understand why this is the case, but nevertheless act against their better understanding. But Plato, the author, is like Plato, the philosopher, who wishes to indicate that in such cases, in addition to philosophical arguments, a treatment is needed that might support Socrates' partner to accept the results of the arguments and to behave accordingly. Under such circumstances, it makes sense to introduce traditional rhetorical elements like similes, narratives, myth, parabolae, accumulation of arguments or metaphors into the philosophical text. It also becomes clear that these rhetorical elements will not be applied to just persuade the partner in order to win the case as traditional rhetoric does. Plato's philosophical orator Socrates rather wishes to enable his partner to listen to the arguments and to act according to their results. If they accept them, to be compelling, i.e., not to obey the little child within them, but to trust their rational minds. That is to say, Socrates' rhetorical treatment within philosophical discourse aims at improving the disposition of his partners and at preparing them for a dialectical conversation. He uses rhetorical forms of communication. He regards these persuasive elements as arguments that reach the soul of his partners, as Axiorchos in the pseudo-Platonic dialogue Axiorchos terms them. This dialogue Axiorchos indeed well that and how these arguments that reach the soul, his soul, work, and that persuasive elements are of help where dialectic fails. So let us for a moment focus in this dialogue. In the Axiorchos, Socrates tries hard to convince Axiorchos, who is seriously ill and fears to die. He argues that the soul is immortal and that he therefore should not fear anything. He confesses to be impressed by the arguments, but he is not prepared to believe in their results and remains frightened. He asks for arguments that reach his soul, as he says, i.e., which purify security and disbelief and help him to behave according to of the arguments. Socrates obeys and therefore adds a myth about a positive perspective in the after addition to his philosophical arguments. Of course, these stories about the Hades are not meant to replace philosophical arguments, but they are added to console the child within Axiorchos as Socrates himself. And Socrates' paramythia is successful. Axiorchos is consoled and seems happy. This scene again illustrates that and how rhetoric can and even should come to help when philosophical arguments fail. The pseudo-Platonic Axiorchos, I suggest, reads like a commentary on what happened in Plato's genuine dialogues as well. For as we have seen, they are well illustrated, they as well illustrate Socrates indeed is critical about traditional rhetoric, yet he does not try to get rid of it, but to accept and integrates rhetorical strategies into the philosophical discourse. In doing so, Plato indicates traditional has to be transformed from an independent method of communication into what might be called a pedagogical tool. And he also signals why and when this is acceptable. It is acceptable when parts have difficulties to cope with the results of philosophical and dialectical discourse. And he signals why this is the case. This is also, I think, confirmed and illustrated well in the Republic. In this dialogue, the use of rhetorical elements and its relation to the disposition of Socrates' partners helps to understand better some aspects of Socrates' behavior, especially as it comes to the end of the discussion in that dialogue. Just to remind ourselves, in the Republic, Socrates discusses the essence of justice together with Adeimantos and Glaukon, proves the immortality of the soul, and finally concludes that justice contributes to happiness, that it is better to be just than to be unjust, because otherwise the soul would be harmed. At this point, the dialectical search for justice has ended. According to Socrates, the dialectic for this has come to an end because the essence of justice has been determined. And yet, Socrates suggests not to stop, but to add something, pros ekenois, as Socrates. Quote Socrates, then, said I, Glaucon, there can no longer be any objection, can there, to our assigning to justice and virtue, generally in addition, various rewards and wages that they bring to the soul from men and gods, both while the man still lives and after his death, 612 BC. So, to assign to justice and virtue a description of its rewards and wages in life, in addition, prosakenos, to the arguments, I think is remarkable. One wonders as to why it really is to add a story about the rewards of justice. After all, the philosophical investigation has been successfully concluded, as Socrates himself agrees. One also might be astonished that Socrates at the end is prepared to talk about such rewards and advantages at all, because as the reader of the Republic will and should well remember that at the beginning of the discussion, 3a, Socrates has rejected to do just that, namely to describe the positive consequences of just behavior in life. Poets like Homer and Hesiod, he says, do this. Fathers, when they educate and persuade their sons to behave justly. According to Socrates, this kind of advertising justice is unnecessary from a philosophical point of view. Arguments, or so, should suffice, and therefore he declines to tell stories and prefers to discuss the matter with dialectical arguments, as one would expect from a philosopher. Yet now, at the end of this philosophical discourse, he seems to have changed his mind. He finally seems to be prepared to apply the old-fashioned pedagogical method of illustrating the positive consequences of justice in life by stories about positive consequences to show that it pays in life. And he does so as an addition to the arguments, he says. He goes on to tell the story about the Pamphylia heir, who, after his death and his reawakening, reports as an eyewitness what to expect in the underworld consequence of one's life. Well, one wonders, or should wonder, I think, what made Socrates change his mind and add a story which he himself earlier had declared to be superfluous philosophically. And it seems to signal as well using the expression "and in addition to," because this in addition to reminds one of the rhetorical strategy of accumulation of arguments, which was applied by Socrates in discourse as well, as we already have seen in the Phaedo, where Socrates was adding up arguments as part of his parametheia, supporting his partners to overcome their emotional resistance by what he called their inner child. I suggest that Socrates adds the myth about air as a rhetorical argument for just that reason here as well. He obviously wishes to reach the soul of his partners, as it were, in order to persuade them to accept what has been shown by humans. For if one focuses on the behavior of Socrates' partners in the Republic, it becomes clear also, I think, that Socrates' partner, Glaucon and Aimontos, indeed are in need of this kind of support, for sure. They are talented, but from time to time the difficulties follow these arguments, or they seem to have doubts, although they agree that the arguments are coherent. For example, when it comes to define the essence of goodness and justice, expanding on this, and instead offers three parable stories as a substitute: the famous parable of the sun, parable of the lions, and of the cave. Socrates explicitly described the cave parable as fitting for people like you and me, adding to the perspective faculties of his interlocutors. And little later, Socrates explicitly talks about his doubts concerning the ability to follow his argument. Quote, My dear Glaucon, he says there, you will no longer be able to follow me. Fourth A. Socrates' remark is harsh and parrhesiastic, as it were. And yet, Glaucon is not offended. He rather accepts the situation. I am, by the way, as far as I can follow your opinion, he says. As the great Ficino already observed, Socrates always takes the disposition of his partners, the Archaeon, into account when he decides to address people in certain ways, for instance, openly as in Parrhesias. Socrates does so when he is taught philosophically hopefuls, but need support. Ficino calls this pedagogical approach the mos Socraticus. I suggest that mos Socraticus also is responsible when Socrates is falling back on rhetoric as comparison, narrative, or myth in general. He does so in order to reach their souls, the souls of his partners, or to convince them. For that reason, he, for instance, introduces the famous comparison between the soul and model in trying to define what justice is. Because, as he says, it is easier to use the city as a model rather than to scrutinize self, because the soul is small and a tiny thing, and therefore difficult to analyze. Suggestion come as a surprise in the philosophical discourse, but which gets profile when we learn in the Politikos that and how exactly this kind of parabolae and similes were used by teachers to instruct pupils at school. The addition of at the end of the philosophical discussion should be seen in this pedagogical context. Obviously, the story is meant to give the philosophical argumentation a greater impact on Glaucon and Adeimantos, and again, that rhetorical elements in Plato's philosophical conversations are introduced to illustrate, to confirm, and to make plausible the results of an abstract dialectical discussion. Socrates himself confirms this in the Gorgias, when he argued that inwardly ordered people are unrestrained and love-orientated people. For in order to affirm this, he adduces the comparison of the soul of the unrestrained people with the sea and the perforated burrow. Socrates admits that this comparison may seem strange in a philosophical context, but he regards it as helpful. He uses parables like this one, or so he says, quote, to make and persuade you of what has been argued before, 493c. According to Socrates, the simile is used not as an argument, but to make the result of an argument more acceptable. That is, Socrates prepared to accumulate arguments, to use similes or to add stories in order to eliminate the distrust, the apistia, and to reach the souls of his partners. So, if one focuses on the dramatic or performative level of the dialogues, on Socrates' partners, it becomes also, I think, evident that rhetorical elements are introduced to persuade partners of Socrates who have difficulty to adopt positions and opinions that are established by philosophical arguments and to act accordingly. But Plato also makes it clear that there is a ranking. Rhetoric indeed does play a role in the philosophical discourse of Plato, Socrates as well, but it plays the role of an ancilla philosophiae, which meant not to replace dialectical arguments, but support it only. We have suggested so far that some aspects or motives of the performative level of the dialogues can be helpful to understand the role which Plato's rhetorical strategies in philosophical discourse, and that the disposition of Socrates' partners is of great importance. In the last part, I wish to remind us that the laws kind of confirm our observations, and for in the laws, the aspect of the ordinary man and how he or she can be convinced by arguments or should be persuaded by rhetorical means, in addition, is a main topic and almost a leitmotif. The combination of philosophy and supplementary persuasion kind of structures the entire work, because the addressee in the text are people who need to be addressed by arguments which reach their souls, as it were, in order to adapt their behavior, rules, or laws, which themselves are the result of rational argumentation. In the laws, therefore, the auxiliary and pedagogical function of rhetoric is confirmed and illustrated. We observe, for instance, that narratives are used because it is a reason to fear that philosophical arguments fail to convince. When, for instance, both the Athenian and his partner agree they had a good conversation with a partner who accuses the gods of humor, the Athenian nevertheless suggests that some addition might be helpful. Quote, and now, as I think, we have argued quite sufficiently with him, who loves to censor the gods, the Athenian says, and Cleinias agrees. And, quote, and it was by forcing him, iaxestai, by our arguments to acknowledge that what he says, wrong, the Athenian says, and he continues, but still he needs also, as it seems to me, some words of counsel, mythoi, to act as a charm upon him. 903a. That is, the Athenian obviously suspects that the force via of argument apodexis is not enough. It has to be completed by some enchanting words, the Athenian calls it, that is by a story, This theme, of course, reminds us of what we have observed at the end of the discussion about justice in the Republic. In the laws as well, compelling arguments have been offered, yet more is needed. An epode, or enchantment, i.e., a story about the fate of the souls after death. The story which follows, therefore, is told to illustrate and to confirm the results of what has been argued for in the philosophical, which forms the basis of the law against azebeia. Again, it is demonstrated that it might be useful to support philosophical apodexis by a narrative, to persuade the citizens to accept the philosophical discourse. Plato illustrates that people might be open to philosophical arguments, but may need some additional persuasive enchantment to overcome their uncertainty and to bring their feelings into harmonia with rational thinking, as the Athenian says. This corresponds to what we have established in the Politeia and in other dialogues as well. For sure, in the laws we encounter Plato's critical attitude rhetoric as well. But in this dialogue, it also is recognized that, and it is described that and when rhetorical elements may be introduced as a kind of praeparatio philosophica, which and produce an emotional change in them so that they become more amenable to advice and better. We therefore observe an element of continuity between earlier dialogues and the laws as far as variation and the use of rhetorical elements in the philosophical discourse are concerned. If we focus on Socrates' partners in earlier dialogues as well, the dialogues show that it is part of the most Socratic from the beginning to the end to adapt to partners, and part of this help is to apply persuasive means provided by rhetoric when these partners waver and hesitate to accept the force of philosophical apodexis. Come to a conclusion. We have discussed the relationship between rhetoric and philosophical argumentation, Socrates' discussions in Plato's dialogues. We saw Cicero is right, that there is a lot of rhetoric in the dialogues, but we also have observed, so I think, no need to be surprised as Socrates was. For, as I suggest, the story about the old dispute between philosophy and rhetoric, which Plato began and which seems to separate his Socrates from other Socratics like Anis or Aeschines, should be modified at least a bit. No doubt, Plato's Socrates had problems concerning the traditional understanding of rhetoric, but Plato's Socrates does not reject rhetoric toto modo. He recognizes that rhetoric might prove to be useful in philosophical discourse when the power of purely rational arguments seems not to be sufficient to generate convictions in the addressee which will direct. That is, Plato's Socrates accepts rhetoric as part of philosophical discourse as other Socratics do as well. But this understanding of what it means, but his understanding of what's to make the addressee better, i.e. to create order within the soul of the addressees and of the role which rhetoric has to play in the philosophical discourse is more complex and more reflected upon as far as I see. For also, Plato stresses its auxiliary, pedagogical, and preparatory function and focuses on the circumstances when rhetorical elements might be useful. The dialogues illustrate that and how the tradition transformed into what one might call an ancilla philosophia. Now, the ancilla function of rhetoric propagated by Plato's Socrates has also, I think, been very influential, and its relation to the force philosophical apodexis can be pursued in texts of later Platonists as well, like Plutarch, Plotinus, or even Proclus, but of others where it is reflected upon and often structures the presentation of the philosophers. It also is relevant, also it's, I think, when one is interested in analyzing the relation of philosophy and literature in ancient philosophical texts. In my paper today, I wanted just to remind us that for this tradition, Plato's Socrates sets the scene as a pedagogical philosophus rhetoricus. Thank you very much.